שלום, ברוכים הבאים לסימפוזיון החגיגי שאנחנו עורכים לכבודה של פרופסור רות ברמן. איפה היא, דרך אגב? אז איכשהו אורחת שרצוי שתהיה. לא רק לכבוד יום הולדתה, אלא ממש ביום הולדתה, שזה דבר ממש לא רגיל. אחרי שאנחנו דנו בשאלה הכבדת המשקל הזאת זמן לא מבוטל, החלטנו שאת הסשן הראשון הזה, עד האתנחתא המוזיקלית הראשונה, אנחנו ננהל באנגלית לכבוד האורחים שלנו שאינם דוברי עברית, ואחר כך אנחנו נתרכז בעברית, לכבוד העובדה שהעברית היא השפה סביבה מסתובב רוב המחקר של רות, אם גם לא כולו. I was just explaining to our guests that we shall begin with an English speaking session, and I will open in English, and in the second half of this session of this symposium we will be moving on to Hebrew. By that time you will all understand Hebrew, so this should work. And let me just and I mentioned that this festive symposium is in honor of Ruth for her 80th on the occasion of her 80th birthday and on her birthday, and this is why we all clapped. And reason you want to know that. Let me just make two announcements. One is that at 5 minutes after 7 there will be a siren. Don't worry, it's not a war that just began. No. It's an exercise of the army, and if someone feels he must get out to the secure area, he can, but we will just wait until the siren is over and then we'll go on, and don't tell anybody. The other thing is more mundane and less dramatic. Please turn off your cell phones. That's not very original. Now, let me, just before we go on, I will just say one word about me so that you know why I don't belong here. I'm a member of the Israel Academy of Science as a historian. And I'm here because I've been almost 40 years a colleague of Ruth Berman, and in the last several years also have been with her in the academy, and we got to know each other and to like each other. So in our old age, we became friends. So it has been, I was asked to present, and I'm glad. And let me just tell you, in order to save my honor, that I'm not entirely foreign to the linguist interest, because I've had in my time a project on deaf and mute in the 18th century. And as you know, linguists are interested that not only in those who can speak and speak, but also in those who can't speak, like the deaf-mute. And even in the 18th century, linguists were interested in them. In fact, almost everyone who wrote on language mentioned them and said something about them and learned something from them. So from this perspective, I have some vague notion what you are all talking about, and this is also the reason why, another reason why I agreed to take upon me this job. Now let me also do in a equally quick manner a run of the great deeds of our celebrated Ruth. Most of you know about her perhaps more than I do. So there is nothing much new that I can tell you. But let me say that she has had really a model career. Perhaps also not only in the academy, but this I don't know, but certainly in the academy. Ruth was born, you know exactly when, in Cape Town, and has studied in Cape Town, in Edinburgh, at Columbia University in New York, and at the Hebrew University here. So that's already a good beginning. You agree? And she has worked in a variety of fields in linguistics, in psycholinguistics, in language acquisition, on Hebrew as a first language, and more. And so we will hear about it more than once during this evening, and I don't need to mention more in this respect. But I want to tell you that she has also been a model university professor with innumerable PhD students, running teams of researchers, and a special lab called the Berman Lab at Tel-Aviv University. She sat, like me, I must admit, on every possible committee, perhaps not only like she and me, but like most women in the academy. We sit on all possible committees, everywhere, wherever there is a committee, we are there. And she's become emeritus in the year 2004. And like so many of us, this gave her a push to even do more work than she did before. So on all of these works and achievements, we will hear more and in greater detail as we go on. It is now my great pleasure to introduce the first speaker, a guest from Sweden, Professor Sven Stro mqvist from Lund University in Sweden, who is a professor of linguistics there, has served there as a rector and vice president for issues of research. He has established there a lab in the humanities and also headed the Institute for the Study of Languages and Literature. He is linked with Ruth in, among other things, in two important projects, and I'm sure he will mention it and tell you about it, and is a friend and colleague, and it is an honor for me to present you and give you now the floor.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction, and I'm honored and very happy to be here, to be invited and to give a little talk in honor of Ruth. I'm also happy to be back in your beautiful country. I think this is my fourth time here, and I hope there will be many more occasions. Ruth, you will already here get a little idea of what I want to share with you. In the top left corner, there's a fragment of a famous manuscript by Balzac. And in the lower left corner, there is a scriptograph depicting a revision process during text writing. Yes, two projects were mentioned here, the Frog Story project, and I just want to say how much participating in research together with you and the group around you has meant to me for my thinking and development as a researcher. We, together with Dan Slobin and many others, we joined forces in the quest for cognitive consequences of linguistic diversity by means of using the frog story as a famous elicitation thank you, material. Then you initiated the Spencer Project and the comparative study of language development across genres, modalities, and languages. And this was very timely for me. I have, since many, many years, a sweet tooth for technology and technological innovations. And we had just launched a little program, script log, from my group, making use of the computer log to keep track of keystroke events and the temporal patterning and the revisions during text writing. And we were curious to apply this and bring it into the Spencer Project. It was also used a little bit in the Frog Story project. And third, I want to say that it's been such an inspiration to work with you. You have an enormous, contagious appetite to explore new areas and perspectives. And in that spirit, I would like to share some new ideas with you today. I don't remember exactly, but I have some sort of notion that this was one of the very first findings I shared with you on a bus outside Trieste. I said, you know, this is graphs we can construct by script log methodology to give a little overall idea about how writers of the Frog story spend their efforts across the storytelling in writing. And I asked you, do you think this is something that could be useful for research purposes? And you were very encouraging, and we went along to do that. Incidentally, you can see here that the 9 to 12-year-olds spend a lot of effort in a very early phase of the story writing, and then they sort of level out or are worn out from their initial effort. In the other, at the other end of the extreme, the adults can pick their fights and use their efforts much more strategically, using them more for certain episodes, and in particular the beginning and the end of the story are very much elaborated by these more mature writers. Scriptlog keeps track of very small events down to transitions from one keystroke to the next, and this is a scriptlog protocol or a fragment of one, and I've used the arrow here to indicate the transition between two letters, and this transition is particularly interesting because it coincides with a linguistic boundary between the two parts of a lexical compound, maths test, matteprov. And it so happens, for very systematic reasons, I would say, for good reasons, that the by far longest transition pause or transition time interval between any two keystrokes during the writing of this word is exactly in this linguistic boundary. So it indicates that the writing of a single word is not just a motor execution process. It also involves some micro-planning and is sensitive cognitively to linguistic boundaries. And this is a fragment from a personal narrative elicited during the heydays of the Spencer Project. So another constellation of researchers went along with this idea and did indeed launch an experimental design for looking at the writing of compound words or compound word production. And in April this year, we finally managed to publish this piece, and we've elicited compound words by means of visual stimuli like this tennis racket and so on. And we've analyzed the fine-grained temporal patterning of the writing of these words across many, many compounds and many subjects, and we could arrive at some conclusions. For example, compound words seem to be retrieved as whole orthographic units, and the first syllable is fully prepared before writing commences. However, linguistic planning is not fully ready before writing, but cascades into the motor execution phase, where additional planning is needed. And this was seen in the spontaneous writing of a compound in the text writing activity just on the other slide. Here you can see it systematically in this experimental study. And finally, I want to mention that there were very tangible frequency effects here too. So for any sequence of two letters not coinciding with the linguistic boundary, the speed of the writing of these two letters were perfectly proportionate to the frequency of the two letters, as evidenced in a very large corpus of newspaper text. Also an issue we discussed many times in the Spencer project, and which we can now show more systematically. Well, in many ways, it's not so strange that this manuscript was finally published in a relatively prestigious international psycholinguistics journal, because it's very traditional in one sense. It deals with very fast processes, preferably less than 1 second, and it had an experimental design. It was a little less traditional in the sense that it didn't deal with spoken language, but with written language, or writing rather than speaking. It was not extremely traditional in the sense that it challenged a little bit the standard idea in many models of the speech process, that first you plan and then you execute. There was a little planning going on also during execution. But otherwise, these are, to my knowledge and thinking, typical basic assumptions in psycholinguistics. You deal with very fast processes, preferably in most of the psycholinguistic studies, and the assumption is that there is a strictly sequential ordering of the processes of first planning and premeditating the content of an utterance, and then you execute it. Well, let me be a little bit unfair and say that these assumptions are not working very well for slow revision processes, such as the one indicated in this enormously overscribbled manuscript by Balzac. For sure, this narrow, more traditional psycholinguistics I just illustrated does not claim that it could analyze these slow processes very well. But I take this as a little point of departure for how one might want to carry on in a future attempt to grasp a little bit of what's going on here. Anyway, if you read this carefully, maybe my friends who are much better than me in French here can help me out, but you can readily see that the content is very much changed in these revisions. So dimensions underlying the revision process is propositional content, semantic and narrative cohesion is changed a lot, and so on and so forth. But interestingly, Balzac was famous, or rather infamous, for pestering his publisher with demanding new typesettings for every major revision he was doing. And I find this so interesting. Why? Because it suggests that he depended much on the interaction with his physical representation of his thoughts in order to generate new ideas. And that is a hugely underestimated interaction in traditional linguistic and psycholinguistic research. And I'm very curious to learn more about that. How should we go about to learn more about that? I'll take my other example from my serious hobby, photography. This is a picture I took several years ago on central Manhattan. One of my favorite spots for hiding and doing street photography are crossings. And there was an occasional gathering of pedestrians, and some pictures came out better and some of them came out worse. And when I revisited this picture, I got a new idea. There is a picture in the picture which you can enhance in many ways. Look at these interesting faces looking in different directions. The color, wow, that could be something. So I reworked it, and there was not only this internal idea about reworking it from its internal qualities, but also external factors, because I was invited to do an exhibition, and then you have to think about how does this picture go together or interact with neighboring pictures. This is the way it came out. So here are very different dimensions of revision. Qualities of light, size too. I found out that 1 times 1.5 meter would be a very good size for these pictures. I couldn't find out that, you know, by planning it in advance. You have to do a little bit of trial and error, and there is the interplay. So for sure, the interaction with the first sketch or first representations meant a lot for getting new ideas and furthering the work. Now, trying to sum up here. When you look at the traditional linguistic model of communication, there is a sender and there is a receiver. The sender puts together a content and then reshuffles it and packages it into something that could be brought out in writing or speech. The recipient or the receiver takes in this physical signal and tries to, by the inverse process, reconstructing the content. Well, that doesn't work very well for the process I just illustrated. You are both, of course, a sender and a receiver when you look at your own product and get new ideas. So already that basic assumption is sort of a little bit challenged here, I feel.
Listen to the mic, please.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Okay, so you need a more advanced model or theory here of the interaction of the process of producing and the process of perceiving, which would be very interesting to try to work out. The only little act of perception that seems to be allowed in the theory of fast processes would be monitoring, in order to see that you are actually executing what you planned to get done. You have to have some sort of monitoring function. And, but monitoring is a far too weak concept for reworking a manuscript or reworking an artistic picture or so. Concepts like reorienting and exploring seem to me to be much more central. And in terms of actions, you cannot really describe very well what Balzac did by saying he was self-correcting or something like that. Rather, he was reworking or something like that. So what I hope to be able to do in the next year is to maybe render words like reorienting, exploring, reworking, a more exact terminological meaning within a theoretical framework. Finally, I've reread a book I read in my early 20s, and I really fell in love with it again. Gibson's ecological approach to perception, and in particular his notion of affordances. Affordances is a relationship basically in the direction from the physical environment and objects in the environment that affords an agent, an animal, or a person to do something. Just to give you a little taste of what you might be able to say if you apply this theoretical framework and these concepts to the writing process, this is something Gibson himself didn't do. So this is playing around a little bit with the possibilities here. When you write a text fragment, you accomplish a micro change of the environment, and so you have something partly new to reorient towards or to share with someone else. And this can be the basis for getting new ideas on how to develop your text. You could also maybe say that when you speak or write, you do not create an external copy of your internal representation. You create an object with other affordances. Well, maybe you already knew all this, but you know, this is the kind of way of rethinking a little bit what text writing means, and how you can get an idea of how it is possible at all to say when you read your own text, wow, that's an interesting thought. Maybe you can go in that direction. So this is very much what I would like to work more with, and it so happens that I'm invited to be at Stanford University with a group of neuropsychologists this fall. And next time we meet, I hope to be able to report a little bit on how you might construct an experimental framework for testing some of the aspects of what's going on when you rethink your first sketch. Thank you.
Many thanks.